So let me welcome everyone and thank you for all joining today. And we have an exciting session with us in front of us today. So this is a little bit of introductory slides from our side to welcome you to the frontiers of mechanical engineering and science. We started in fall 2020, and I was just mentioning Devesh Ranjan here, who is the chair of mechanical engineering at Georgia Tech, and certainly as was the key person in initiating that, and it's been going on great. So good to see you, Devesh, and thanks everyone from all the organizing committee members from all different schools. So really appreciate it. This is a visual slide for all of us who have been trying to work together. But most importantly, this is where we essentially welcome all of you, and we have two great speakers, Patrick Wensing from Notre Dame and Laura Blumenschein from Purdue University. And with that, I will stop sharing, and then I'll introduce our distinguished moderator, who is Professor Karthik Ramani. So, and let me welcome and introduce Professor Rahmani. So Professor Karthik Ramani is the Donald Feddersen Distinguished Professor of Mechanical Engineering at Purdue. He is also a professor in the School of Electrical and Computer Engineering and holds a courtesy appointment in the College of Education. His research interests are in augmenting humans with virtual tools that extend their capabilities in the physical world. Professor Rahmani has many distinctions, but maybe read a few of those. In summer of 2016, he was a visiting professor at Oxford University, Institute of Mathematical Sciences. In 2008, he was a visiting professor at Stanford University, Computer Sciences, and also a research fellow at PARC, formerly Xerox PARC. Professor Rahmani also served as an editorial board of several journals, including a Journal of Computer Design and the ASME Journal of Mechanical Design. Professor Rahmani, as you could see, is certainly a prolific researcher, has already mentored 35 PhD students, currently probably have another dozen or so ongoing, and also a prolific inventor, having to his record more than 25 of the patents. Some of them have been licensed. Professor Rahmani received his PhD from Stanford University, a master's from Ohio State, and an undergrad from Indian Institute of Technology, Madras, all in mechanical engineering. Here, I would like to give a prompt here. Professor Rahmani has something very interesting to talk about, hopefully when he introduces our two speakers in terms of academic genealogy, how he's connected somehow with these two speakers. Again, I would like to mention that Professor Rahmani doesn't say this, but I would like to mention here as a colleague from here is that Professor Rahmani also has this very rare distinction of being at Purdue, of being recognized by both a Research Excellence Award and also a Commercialization Award, which is rare. Again, congratulations, Professor Rahmani. He doesn't say that, but I wanted to mention that. Professor Rahmani has been a prolific ideator and a convergent thinker. And also he has developed the award-winning toy design. With that, I'll conclude here, but on a very personal note, regarding Professor Rahmani as a colleague, that the word about convergence in a very true and broad sense, I learned about that. So I'll conclude with that, a convergent thinker and ideator. Professor Rahmani, the session is yours. Thank you.
Thanks, Partha, as well as yourself and Sid for having started this multi-university session. It is there to stay even after control of COVID. This is a great idea. So thank you and all the organizers on the effort behind this series. So I wanted to first get into introducing my colleagues, both Patrick as well as Laura, and curiously, I'm just connected to both of them in multiple ways. First of all, I started at Ohio State working on Hexapod, and Patrick's advisor, Oren, was working in a large DARPA project, and of course, I like the Buckeyes as well. And later on, ended up working with Professor Mark Kutkowski at Stanford, and who it turns out also advised Allison, who's a friend of mine. So and I, so different connections to both of them. And I started my career in robotics. So with that, when I talked to them, I was so inspired, wanting to start becoming a student, both of them, in fact, and trying to relearn how exoskeletons may work, how we can get rid of buttons and everything. And I started thinking about the future of what soft robots can be, and pretty nice research done by both of them in abstraction of models, to intent detection, to what tasks are good for soft robots and how we can control exoskeleton and make robots more adaptive. But of course, robots these days are not even close to the ones that I started with, which are mostly armed robots. And they said in those days, robots are going to take over humans. And that story has come back again. Nothing wrong with it. It gives some of our researchers more funding. But also going in this direction, the theme that we are going to hear from both of them is co-design, control design, action planning, and so on, where robots can become more robust in tough environments. And in terms of Laura's talk, we're going to hear a lot about hopefully geometric adaptations and meanings of kinematics and inverse kinematics, all that I studied in 1980s, how that is changing completely in terms of how we can think of soft robots. So with that, without taking any more time, we will start off with Patrick, the hard problems, and then we'll end up with soft problems that are hard. Okay. All right. Go ahead, Patrick.
Thank you, Karthik. Greatly appreciate it. That was perhaps one of the most fun introductions that I've had. It's wonderful. Okay, so thank you again to the organizers for having me. It's a great honor to have this chance to tell you about some of the work in my group, the Robotics Optimization and Assistive Mobility Lab at the University of Notre Dame. So work in my group is focused on advancing the mobility of legged robots, both in the form of quadrupeds and humanoid robots, as well as robots that we might wear on our bodies in the form of assistive exoskeletons or lower limb prostheses. So on the left side, our goal is for these robots to be able to go anywhere on land. And on the right, our goal is to translate some of these advances so that people can go anywhere on land, even after they've had an injury that might otherwise limit their mobility. Now, aside from kind of both of these areas being united in the presence of legs, I think the challenges that are facing these systems are really representative of the ones that are kind of facing our next wave of robotics applications more broadly. So if we think about the first wave of robots, perhaps the robots that Karthik was mentioning at the beginning as the ones that he was working on at the beginning, and we were thinking of these robots that have made a really phenomenal impact on the industrial assembly line, where these robots are complicated to control, but we really don't want them to be around humans. They can be quite dangerous. We've seen robots, however, more recently kind of coming out into the real world, but most of the applications in what I would call the second wave of robotics have been very much, look but don't touch by design. We have drones that are participating in inspection and surveillance, but hopefully not coming in contact with those objects. And very much likewise with autonomous vehicles, we don't want them to come in contact with humans. And this is very much in contrast with what I see as kind of the next wave of applications for robotics, where we want these systems to be kind of out in the world with and amongst us, helping to amplify and restore our human capabilities. So in terms of the challenges that I think we face there, see them as quite different, whether we're working with kind of autonomous systems or ones that are interacting around humans. So we think first about autonomous legged robots. I think the main challenge is just kind of handling the unexpected and all the complexity of the environment out in the real world. We've made some phenomenal progress on this recently. So here, the unexpected for this robot is that it doesn't know that these stairs are there, but the control policies and methods have been kind of tuned up and trained so that they can work in this particular environment. But kind of my overall hypothesis is that as we start to send robots out into the real world, whether they're supporting our troops or going to a disaster zone, the scene of a fire, or in our homes, we're kind of never going to be able to prepare them for everything that they're going to see in these worlds, right? Instead, our robots are going to kind of need to be able to reason through the consequences of their actions so that they can devise creative solutions that are tailored to the situations that they find themselves in. So I think that's the main challenge and need for getting these robots out into the wild. I think it's very different when we think about human-robot interaction applications. And I think we have a little bit of an inflated sense of the state of the art here. based on kind of some of the things that we see on the big screen. So here's our friend Iron Man, and somehow his suit just knows that he wants to stop flying. It just knows that he wants to transition from walking on level ground to walking down these stairs to help him to accomplish that. And that's just kind of very much in contrast to the state of the art. So here's one of the phenomenal systems that we've worked with, the ExoGT exoskeleton from Exobionics. And here the motions just aren't quite as fluid. And that's because this device, isn't really able to get into the mind of the human and pick up on their goals and desires as they walk through the world. One of the challenges here is that everyone's gait is different. If you see your friend on the opposite side of the quad, you can tell that it's them just by looking at the way that they walk. And so a challenge here is really kind of the variability from human to human, in contrast with the variability in the environment, I think, for the more autonomous technologies. So today I'm going to talk through two different threads of work where we've begun to address these challenges. On the legged locomotion side, we're going to take a look at a new way that our robots can structure their prediction in terms of the way that they think through the consequences of their actions as they move through the world. Then we'll take a look at some work that we've been doing on intent detection for assistive mobility. I'll focus most on that exoskeleton case and looking at how we can personalize these strategies for the people that are using these devices. Okay, so let me start on this first part. So we're using a control strategy that's known as Model Predictive Control, or MPC for short. And so before I start talking about this, I just want to kind of give a brief intro into this way of approaching control. So Model Predictive Control goes as follows. You measure or estimate the current state of the robot, and then you come up with a plan, thinking about how to get from where you're at to where you want to go. We formulate this as an optimal control problem posed over a hybrid system model for our robot, for which we've recently developed some custom numerical methods for accomplishing this. We then take and follow that plan for a short period of time into the future, and then repeat this process. So if I look at my robot here on the left, this red trajectory represents the plan. The robot follows that for a brief period of time into the future, and then comes up with a new plan over and over again. So what's the state of the art in terms of model predictive control? Well, conventionally in the field, MPC is pursued in a hierarchical fashion where we solve kind of a hierarchy of optimization problems. Let's just say for a robot, it needs to come up with a plan for a long horizon into the future, thinking out a couple of steps. And that's computationally somewhat of a difficult problem. So we often use simplified models of locomotion. So as an example, in that video at the beginning with the robot climbing the stairs, we used a lumped single rigid body model. We thought about coming up with plans for how to apply forces underneath the feet to move this body through the world. That allows you to focus kind of on the most important aspects of locomotion, but still leaves kind of a lot of additional detail that you need to stitch in. So this requires another optimization process or a controller in order to fill in those details. So for instance, when climbing up those stairs, there were some swing-like trajectories that were heuristically designed along with an additional optimization-based controller to help track them. And this works well in some isolated scenarios, but as you go out into more complicated environments, some of these strategies break down. And in particular, you might need to think about reevaluating what type of model you're using. Frequently, we think about there being kind of an inherent trade-off when making that choice of the model to use in our prediction. So kind of on one side of the spectrum for a choice that you could make, you could use a very simplified model, for instance, just thinking about how the center of mass moves through the world. The benefit of this is that by using a simple model, you can do quite fast computation over it. But based on these simplifications or restrictions, you often have limited disturbance rejection in terms of the pushes that you might be able to recover from or the terrains that you might be able to walk over as they shift under your feet. You can, of course, add in a little bit more detail, for instance, maybe considering the orientation of the body and thinking about how that's going to evolve into the future, or one that's become a little bit popular is this model where you think about the overall linear and angular momentum, or the centroidal angular momentum of the system, and think about the full kinematics. And this is kind of the model of choice that we've seen from the Boston Dynamics team recently with their humanoids. On the kind of the complete end of the spectrum, you can consider modeling all of the detailed whole body, rigid body dynamics of your robot. And the benefit here is that kind of by modeling everything, you can really unlock the full performance envelope of the system. But the downside being that since you're working with a more complicated model, the computations are a little bit more beefy to deal with. So in the past, we viewed there kind of being this unavoidable trade-off. I'm either going to work with this simplified model that I can compute with quickly, that has limited performance, or kind of on the other end, I'm going to have to suffer, slow computational performance, but really I can unlock and optimize any motion of my robot. Recently, we've been rethinking that and asking the question, well, how can we kind of get the best of both worlds by rethinking about how we accomplish our prediction? And so to motivate that, I'd like you to put yourself in the shoes of this hiker. Let's think about, if you need to get from where you're at to the other side of the stream, kind of what details are you thinking through and planning out and thinking about your approach here? Maybe you have some idea of, the configuration that you're going to take for the next immediate step, and maybe for the next one you've picked out what rock you're going to put your foot on. But, the further out that you're thinking about your plan, the more fuzzy it is, the more abstraction there is. So kind of at a high level, I think we need to be structuring our prediction more like the hiker here in order to kind of squeeze the most performance out of our system without bogging it down computationally. So conventional MPC is a hierarchy of optimization problems. Come up with a plan using some simplified model, and then come up with another plan over the short horizon that tries to match that, considering the whole body dynamics. Instead, if we structure our prediction more like the hiker, we're going to pose one problem over a hierarchy of models, where we think about our whole body detail in the near term and use our abstract models to reason through the consequences of our actions further out into the future. Let me show you some of the results of this. So first, let's take a look at the two different ends of the spectrum, the simple model MPC and the whole body MPC. And I'm going to run some simulations where I'm going to put some disturbance forces on these robots as they try to run forward. So I've got a bunch of different disturbances, and when the robots violate joint limits or pitch too much, they get removed from the simulations. So we see the simple model MPC has more failures than this whole body MPC. We kind of took this anecdotal experiment and scaled it up on our supercomputer and looked at here on this x-axis, this is the force that's applied to the robot, and on the y-axis is the probability of success. So here in the dark blue, this is showing the probability of success for the simplified model MPC. It starts to fail around 30 newtons of push. And then here, this tube that I'm showing you represents the 95% confidence interval that I have based on the number of tests that we ran. If you instead use the whole body model, it's more robust. It handles these disturbances more gracefully, up to about 130 newtons, and then it begins to degrade. Of course, kind of the price that you pay here is that the whole body MPC is about 10 times more computationally costly than the simple model MPC. Let's take a look at this model hierarchy idea via comparison. So here we're doing the planning where the robot essentially for the next two gait modes, one stance and one flight, thinks about its full body detail and then uses that fuzzier, more abstract model to think about how things are going to go for the long term. So here's the probability that we had before. And now overlay in the performance of this model hierarchy. See that it doesn't do quite as well as the whole body MPC, but it's really close. And particularly for these largest disturbances, we're kind of within the range of error for statistical significance. So we perform about on par with the whole body MPC, but we do so while cutting the computational requirements by a factor of 6 when we do this in C++. In MATLAB, we get about a factor of 2, and C++ we get a factor of 6 benefit, which I think is really exciting. By structuring the way that we think through the consequences of our actions, we can keep the same level of performance as before while cutting this computation by 6. We've also been looking at applying this in hardware. So this is an experiment from my student, Her Lee, who worked on this project with our mini cheetah robot that we have down in the lab. So here, the robot's cheating a little bit. It knows in advance where this white area is that it's not supposed to step on. But it's able to use this model hierarchy in this case. You know, when you have fewer computational requirements, you can think further out. So the robot's able to think about the need that it need to accelerate to jump over this gap earlier than if it didn't apply this model hierarchy strategy. Okay. So we're really excited about these results. We're continuing to push on them in my group. But the one thing I would say is that here, in terms of handling differences in the environment, everything's done through control. But if you look at the biological realm, you see that some control actually happens through the kind of passive dynamics of the body. So as an example, here's an experiment from Bob Foll's group, where they had a cockroach run across this little gel pad, and they attached a little cannon to its back. And so they applied this disturbance to the cockroach and then looked at the stabilizing response that it had. And what they found actually was that a great deal of the stabilizing response could actually be attributed to kind of the natural compliance of the robot's legs and not to any kind of closed loop centralized control. So what we've been looking at recently with my student Gabriel Bravo is how we can look at design and control together, so that we, rather than just designing a robot and then handing it off to a control designer, we treat these problems together in order to ensure synergy between them. And so what we've been looking at is how can we design a robot so that it's able to handle all sorts of different type of terrain conditions, and such that some of the response to those terrain conditions are happening through kind of passive compliance that's in the mechanism. We've been doing this mostly in simulation, but we have some initial hardware that we've built and that we're just starting to test that I'll look forward to reporting on further down the road. I wanted to include this kind of as a little tie-in to what Laura is working on in terms of kind of the importance of compliance and finding ways to engineer compliance into our robots. Okay, so we've addressed this way to for our robots to think through the consequences of their actions to handle more challenging environments. And I'd like to shift gears and talk about how we can handle the variability from human beings that might be inhabiting our assisted devices. So in terms of the state of the art for rigid exoskeletons, this is kind of what it might have looked like in rehabilitation before exoskeletons were available, with physical therapists manually manipulating limbs to move them through gait. Now, with the use of exoskeletons, we can reduce the burden on therapists. We need fewer of them, it's less taxing, and can produce more repeatable gait patterns during rehab. The kind of end goal here is that we'd like these devices to be able to go home with people and out into the community so that they can interact with the community from a standing posture as opposed to from a wheelchair. One of the challenges with these devices is kind of here you can see this therapist is holding a pendant. And so anytime a change needs to be made to the gait, she's kind of keying that into the device. Instead, what we'd like to be able to do is to pick up on small changes in your motion that might telegraph changes that you want to make to your walking speed. And we're doing that by looking at sensors that are already on board the exoskeleton in terms of angles of hip and knee motors, as well as currents of those motors and contact sensors under the ground. So we have an open source data set that we've been using to conduct our studies. And if you're interested, I hope you might use it too. So this was a study that was conducted by my student, Taylor Gambin, with our industrial collaborators at Exobionics. So Taylor ran a study with 6 subjects, 3 uninjured individuals and 3 with an incomplete spinal cord injury. And she had them walk through this mocap arena and commanded them to either speed up, slow down, or make no change in their gait. We monitored all those sensors on board the suit and have made that information available as part of an open source data set that's associated with Taylor's recent IEEE Access paper. So I encourage you to take a look if you're interested in this area, and if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. So again, our goal is that we'd like to be able to use these sensor readings that we've collected in order to estimate that the user has made a change in their desired walking speed. So if I think back to kind of like the first part of the talk, these simplified models that we were using to plan locomotion, they were often focused on figuring out, what force is being applied under the foot at a specific location. And, kind of the reason being that when you select a footstep, you're stuck with it both now and into the future. So our hypothesis was that choices of ground contact would carry a great deal of information regarding the intent of the individual. And in particular, we were motivated by some recent work that showed that changes in step length are well correlated with changes in gait speed from step to step. So we've been using this insight to pursue intent detection through the following method. We collect a bunch of data, and from that data, we glean the walking speed. So here, VK is the forward walking speed on the kth step. We glean that data as well as other features of the gait, for instance, looking at the step length. And based on those previous studies, we fit a linear model that relates the current walking velocity and the change in walking velocity and the leg length to the step length that we observe. Here, we're basically viewing the velocity at the next step kind of as a proxy for your desired walking speed at the current step. We then consider a state vector that contains both the center of mass position, velocity, and this kind of latent, unknown desired walking speed. We don't know it, but we now have a measurement model for it, which enables us to apply Bayesian strategies. We're using Kalman filtering tools in order to infer this desired walking speed. Let me show you some of the results. So here on the x-axis, I'm showing you the step number. And on the left in blue, this represents the measured walking speed. So here on this 8th step of the data, the user was commanded to speed up. And so between this mid stance of one support for their leg, they sped up from about 0.45 up to 0.75 meters per second. On the right here in orange is the change in the estimate of the desired velocity from step to step. In other words, this is how much we think the user wants to speed up on this step. So here our estimator is saying we think they want to speed up 0.3 meters per second, which agrees kind of quite well with how much they did speed up. So here essentially the estimator is working when the slope of the blue line matches the sine of this stem plot. And through this strategy, we were able to get performance up to about 78% success rate at preemptively identifying speed change in users with incomplete spinal cord injury. That's to say, when their foot would touch down, we would identify, oh, you probably want to speed up. And then by the time that step was over, they had sped up 78% of the time. The challenge with this, however, was that for each individual, we required a good bit of training data. We needed 70 steps of training data to get these results. And if you think about, in a rehab setting, you want to spend all the time possible doing rehab, not a lot of time gathering data to calibrate the exoskeleton to the individual. So we've recently been asking the question, well, how can we address this data scarcity problem? And in particular, if we have a bunch of data from healthy individuals, how might we be able to combine that data set and just sprinkle in a little bit of data from a specific new user in order to get a personalized estimator? We've been doing that through the following methods. Let's assume we have a bunch of this base data and some additional novel data. We first take that base data and we kind of shift it so that it matches the novel data. We shift it so it has the same mean and same standard deviation. And then we pull this together with the novel data. And there's a number of different things that you consider here when doing pooling. you could ask the question, which base user should I use? Should I bring the data of person 1 and 2 or 3 and 4? Which would be most informative? Right now, we've just been using all of the base data that we have. Another question that you might have is, if I have some novel data, should I use all of the trials? And I think our conventional wisdom is use all of your data. But in our case, for people that have an incomplete spinal cord injury, they might have some motor spasticity such that some of the trials are not so informative of their behavior overall. And so what we've been looking at is how to basically be selective about what novel data to use in this pooling process. Once we are done with the pooling, we have some data on the desired velocity using that trick from the previous slide, and some gate features that include the step length, step frequency, and that type of stuff. We're then evaluating the quality of this pooling using some information theoretic notions, in particular using the mutual information between these desired velocities and the gate features that we measure. So this mutual information kind of represents the formally it's the Kullback-Leibler divergence between the joint probability distribution and the product of two marginal probability distributions, and kind of captures the the information and the correlation between these variables. And this gives us basically an anticipated quality for our estimator. Let me show you how this does. So if we just use the base data, here I'm showing you the performance of our estimator for 2 of our subjects. And the height of the blue bar represents the percentage of success in correctly identifying speed up or slowdowns. And here, this number represents the RMS velocity error in terms of the difference between the measured and the estimated velocity. One thing that you might be wondering is, well, what happens if you just apply that data transformation and you don't do any pooling? It turns out that for us, it makes the estimated performance a little bit worse in terms of the probability of success, and makes the velocity estimation quite bad. So just for reference, 12.8 meters per second is about twice the speed of an Olympian running in the 5K. So that's a lot of velocity error. But if we take this data and we just sprinkle in just a little bit of novel user data, talking 8 to 12 steps worth, we end up getting estimator performance that is even better than we had before. So we're going from 70 steps worth of training data required down to 10. And by pooling this with base data, we're able to amplify the performance of our estimator, which I think is really exciting. I should mention this is work done by my student Rupak Karulkar, who's getting close to graduating. Okay, so that's some of the work we've been doing on the exoskeleton side. I'd like to quickly plug some of the work that we're doing on lower limb prostheses. In terms of getting the human in the loop, there's many options. With that exoskeleton, we were looking at sensors that were already on board the device. But in terms of understanding the user's goals and intentions, there are other sensors that are available. For instance, EMG electrodes that we're looking at using. And so in the past, a lot of control strategies have either been purely autonomous, taking feedback from the prosthesis itself, or purely volitional in terms of taking readings from an EEG skull cap or EMG sensors on board the prosthesis. And so what my student Ryan Posh is looking at is, how can we combine these two together? So that if you just want to walk on level ground, you don't have to think about it. You can let the autonomous controller take care of it. But if you want to do something special, like stand up on your tiptoes, you have the flexibility of doing that. And so Ryan's done some great work on this right at the beginning of some human subject studies on it. I, again, kind of look forward to telling you about down the road. Okay, so kind of zooming back out, as we look to send our robots out in the wild, for our autonomous legged robots, managing the complexity of the environment, having ways for our robots to think through the consequences of their actions is a real challenge that we've been taking a look at. And for our assistive devices, I think the main challenge comes from kind of the variability of the different humans that are using it. And I'm excited about some of the recent work that we've done there as well. So with that, thank you for your attention. I'll thank my funding agencies, and looking forward to Laura's talk.
Thank you, Patrick. Very nice talk. I would like the audience to write down their questions or just type them into the chat. At the end of Laura's session, we can group and have a nice discussion now that we have a really interested group present in this talk. So Laura, you want to go ahead?
Sure, let me go ahead and share. Let me know if you can see that.
It's all.
Thank you. Okay, yeah, so obviously I'd like to also thank the organizers of this this webinar. Very glad to be talking about some of my interesting work and some of the more recent work that my students have been up to, as well as just following Patrick's excellent talk on, some of the wonderful things that I think you can do with rigid robotics now that you have these really established things. Really established kinematics and dynamics and all of the modeling he was talking about. So I'm going to be taking a step back and let's go to kind of the infancy of another growing field, soft robotics. And within this field, I'm going to be talking about what I'm going to call, let me get a pointer up, what I'm going to be calling task-focused design of soft robots. Task here is a word that I'm going to be a little liberal in using, where I'm just more talking about kind of fitting the morphology of the robot to what we want it to do. And I have a secret sub header for this talk, which is, can you tie a robot in a knot? So look forward to that later in the talk here. So we've already seen a lot about kind of more traditional rigid robotics. Patrick had a great intro on, sort of where robots have gone as we're looking from traditional, factory robots like this. But I also like to start from that kind of perspective when talking about soft robots, right? So soft robots are coming into this existing field of robotics where we have a lot of robots that are really, really good at doing precise, repetitive tasks. And these robots are not friendly for humans to be around, but they are very, very good at what they do. And so this is a great contrast then to what I'm going to be talking about, which is the field of soft robotics. So soft robotics, on the other hand, take a lot of their inspiration from nature. This is not my work here. This is work of a lot of other, colleagues in soft robotics, but it's a nice representative slide I like to show of the vast variety of different inspirations that soft robotics has. So we've got little crawling robots. We have fish-like robots. We have robots that are imitating, squid arms or elephant trunks. Robots that can imitate peristaltic worm gates. And then, even systems, actuators that kind of act like a proboscis or something like an insect structure. And besides just having this inspiration from nature, what the underlying feature that all of these robots have is that they are changing their morphology through compliance in order to change their behavior and adjust to a task. Now, a lot of the systems here, or all of the systems here, are taking their inspiration from kind of the animal side of nature. And so I think I'd like to just briefly say that there's a wide range of natural morphologies left to be explored, which I think are really interesting for soft robotics as well. So one, obviously near and dear to my heart, is plants and vines. So we think about looking at this sped up video of a vine trying to find a point to grab onto in its environment. It eventually does, and it wraps around. Again, this is a behavior that is in the morphology of the vine itself. It's not, there are some chemical changes when it actually does find this, structure to grab onto, but for the most part, it's kind of just repeating this behavior, and the morphology is what allows it to grasp this structure. And then we even have very weird systems, right? These are slime molds. If you've never seen a slime mold before, they're very odd creatures, but they have interesting movement capabilities based off of their bodies. And so this is just to inspire that there's lots of new directions to go. And this sort of building that we've been doing with soft robotics into these kind of animal forms is not the only way we can go. Okay, so I'm saying that that's not the only way we can build soft robots. So how do I propose we do design soft robots? What should we do if we're not just going to imitate animals, or if we're not just going to kind of make rigid robots but compliant? Well, for me at least, it starts with acknowledging this high link between morphology and behavior of soft robots. And as a result, our primary tool that we're going to look at using is modeling. As long as our models are simple enough, Patrick talked a lot about this in model predictive control as well, how the complexity of the model changes how you approach things. But for us, if our models are simple enough, that makes modeling a good design tool. And the models I'm going to look at specifically are models that pull from geometric constraints. And by using these geometric constraints, we're going to build simple kinematic building blocks. You can think of this akin to the joints that you have in a rigid robot. And we're going to use these building blocks repeatedly to create complex behaviors. And the goal here then is that this combination of modeling and geometric constraints can yield design principles for creating complex and useful kinematics. Okay, so with that as a sort of intro to the work I'm going to be talking about, here are the 3 little projects I'm going to go through that kind of build off of this designing soft robots through geometric modeling. So let's talk about this first one, design of soft delta mechanisms first. So here we are going to start with the kind of easiest approach to design through these building blocks, which is we're going to take a 1 degree of freedom actuator. So here we've just got a little pneumatic actuator. It is a bellows actuator, bellows based off of the shape. And it's got a linear behavior, relatively linear behavior with pressure. You can see it extending here, this single degree of freedom. Just to give a little bit of background on these actuators, they are 3D printed. We've done these a few different ways. We've done multi-material printing through PolyJet, which is the object printer, and then SLA printing from Forum Labs. And the big benefit here, at least for soft robotics and for modeling, is that they change length primarily through bending, as opposed to primarily through stretching of the wall material. The reason why this is a big benefit is that these elastic materials can have very nonlinear models when we talk about straining them. But here through bending, we're not creating a lot of strain of the material itself. We are mostly creating strain in the actual structure. As I said, to cut to the chase, we get very nice linear behavior out of these bellows. So here is pressure versus length. Over here, we have pressure versus force at different lengths. And so we have this nice linear actuator based off of pressure. And so immediately we think, let's build something more complex with this. So let's take 3 actuators, let's put them into a structure together, and we can get a little compliant delta mechanism. If you've ever seen or tried to work with the kinematics of parallel robots, you might know that usually they're a lot more complicated than this, but here we just turn on different actuators and we get this center point to move about in space. So go ahead and put that to. Where does the modeling come in then? Well, I'm going to cut to the chase, cut out kind of a lot of the experimentation and math just to get to the results here. But when we look at this system and we just talk about the force workspace, so we're going to hold this point in the center constant. The output force that we get is just a linear combination of the forces of the actuators we have. This makes sense because this is, just a force balance equation. And we can see that essentially we get preferential force direction aligned with the actuators. So it's a little easier. We have less total pressure we need to get to a point aligned with one of the actuators as opposed to in between the actuators where they kind of have to work together and we get a little bit of loss energy. This scales very well, so we can take the same design and the same model for our actuator and scale it up to 250% in size. And if we look at the max force output we get, we can see that that scales as well. So here we get a max force of 4.9 newtons, and here we get 28 newtons of force out of 250% increase in the force. So that's nice as well. And then we also get really nice behavior if we just start adding more on. So we can over actuate this point in the center, and we get well predicted behavior from just linearly summing the forces. So again, here is a 4 actuator and a 6 actuator system where we're measuring out these forces in the directions as and the sum of pressure required to get to those forces. And we can see essentially the benefits of adding more actuators in is we kind of smooth out the force distribution over our workspace a little bit. Okay, I've been talking about force though, but when we go back to this video, we see this point actually moving around in space. So what if we want to model that part of things? Can we just use this linear combination model? Well, the answer is yes and no. And it kind of comes down to what we're seeing here, right, which is shear. So we're shearing these actuators in addition to linearly extending them. And so those linear models we started with are not going to be enough now. We need to add in shear. And so now we're going to model both forces and positions together by adding on some shear force modeling of these single actuators. Again, we're only going to be looking at the single actuator as our building block, and we're going to use that to predict the behavior of multi-actuator systems. So in this case, if we take this system, we deform it at various angles, various shear angles, various length changes. We get out a lot of nice data here, which shows us that we stay linear with pressure, which is very nice. But our kind of relationship with pressure based off of our shear force and our axial force changes based off of our length change. So that's color here, or the angle of shear that we have, which is our symbols here. So we get a variation of axial and shear forces as a function of both the pressure and the deformation. To model this, again, we want these kind of simple geometric models. And so we're going to take two approaches. We're going to have one part of our model that is based off of the shear angle changing kind of the pressure, the area effective that the pressure is acting on, looking at it as this sort of deforming tube. And then we have one which is sort of this linear combination of torsional and linear springs to describe the deformation behavior. So if the model we had before was something like this, where we had just forces in the linear direction based off of pressure and scaled based off of our delta L with no consideration of shear, our new model looks something like this. So it's not linear anymore. We've got some theta squared and delta L times theta, but it's still relatively simple overall with our linear stiffness and our torsional stiffness and then our pressure. And if we take this model and we build our delta again here, now we can look at whether we can predict the output position based off of the input pressure. And long story short, again, so I can get onto some of the other topics, the answer is yes, and it works better than just our pressurized spring model from before, where we're just considering the axial forces. Where we can see here, the orange dots are our new axial and shear model, the blue crosses are where the position actually ends up, and the green dots were our previous model. And so we get an overall average error of about 3.5%. Which is really, really good for a soft robotic system if you've ever worked with a soft robotic system. So this is how we would then build from building blocks like single actuators. What if we're trying to describe the behavior of a full soft robot? Can we take this approach of kind of compartmentalizing and tearing apart the pieces and building up a geometric model like that? So to answer that question, let's go on to the second topic, which I've titled here, obstacle interaction to decrease uncertainty. And the theme here is going to be kind of looking at heuristic behaviors of soft robots in order to build these building blocks of our behavior. To describe this section and the next section of work, I'm going to have to introduce the growing robot we have here. So this is our growing robot. This is the kind of main interesting new degree of freedom that we have with the growing robot, which is this extension using pressure and growing from the tip. And overall, the body of the robot is very akin to a continuum robot where we have this long, slender body. If you're unfamiliar with the growing robot, some kind of, going back to this, let's click on some of the videos here. Some of the, can't seem to get these videos to play. So some of the benefits of the growing robot here is that it has a lot of nice interactive behaviors with its environment. So if these videos would play, you would see we have the robot is able to grow through these incredibly sticky structures. It naturally navigates around bends. It grows through very small gaps, and it can even do some digging if we give it a little bit of extra air pressure. So a question we might have then is, how do we actually harness these environmental interactions? And we can do that by observing a really nice heuristic behavior when we interact with an obstacle in our environment. So we grow into an obstacle, the tip of the robot moves tangent to the obstacle, and then we have a pivot back at the base, wherever we most recently contacted an obstacle. So again, tip grows tangent to an obstacle, pivot at a previous constraint, and we grow until we leave the obstacle, at which point we just kind of follow whatever direction we're growing. So this means that our environment will passively guide the robot. This is a lot of times, if you've heard of this in soft robotics before, people refer to this as morphological computation. It really just means we're seeing an interesting or potentially useful behavior from the natural response of the robot. The heuristic we come up with is very simple. It's just depending on the initial contact angle, right? That's going to tell us which direction we're going to grow. So if we hit it at greater than 0 degrees, positive interaction angle here, we'll go one direction. And if we hit it at a negative interaction angle, we'll go the other direction. And that's essentially it for the model. Now, this gets a little more complicated when we think about all of those previous contact points we have, but not too much more complicated. So we just need to define these pivot points where the robot could pivot about. There's two types we'll define, ones that are based off of obstacle contacts, which is what I've shown previously, and then ones that are made based off of pre-made turns that we build into the robot ourselves. So that's something akin to this. And then as we have more obstacle contacts, we're going to add those into our potential pivot points or our potential obstacle contacts that are deforming our system, like this. So just talking about the steering real quick, how do we actually do that? Well, we're just shortening one side of the material, which gets us a turn as we grow. So that's all we mean by those kind of design pivot points. So obligatory math slide, this is what the kinematics come out to then. Just in terms of what we see, we have one kinematic equation to describe when we're not in contact with an obstacle, and then another one describes following the tangent of that obstacle as we grow along it. So if we actually take this behavior and we look at a cluttered environment like this, we can see that it well predicts what we are doing in the environment, as we see here. And the outcome here then is we want to actually use this for design. And the design strategy here is we're going to use this to reduce our error overall. So we know that we have some amount of error potentially in our robot. And if that error gets big enough, we could have this kind of chaotic bifurcation where the behavior of the robot naturally goes in the direction we don't intend it to. So we want to plan in a known environment to reach a desired target with taking this potential uncertainty into account. So the results from that look something like this, where if we've got a target location, we plan out a series of turns and a series of intentional obstacle contacts that get us to a desired target in space with some amount of accuracy. You know, this is all open loop, so there's only so accurate the target hitting can be here. But again, this is very, very nice results for just a kind of a tube growing into space. And you know, if we simulate this, we can see that if we compare this to something like traditional robot planning, where we avoid obstacle contacts, intentionally using obstacle contacts is reducing our uncertainty overall. Okay, to keep inside of the 25 minutes, I'm going to move on to this last topic here, which is my promised, can we tie a robot in a knot? I've already kind of given away the answer with that picture there, but let's talk about how we actually get to tying a robot in a knot. So we're going to be with growing robots again, but now we're going to add active actuation to get a desired shape in space. So maybe we want to wrap around an obstacle, or as I said, maybe we want to do something like tie a robot in a knot so that we can grasp onto something in our environment. The small addendum to be able to do this is we need some way to actively control our shape. So the two ways we do that is either through tendon actuation, which is shown here, essentially pulling a string and collapsing these little pieces along the length to control a shape. Or pneumatic actuation, series pouch motors is what we have here, which essentially gets shorter as we add air in. This allows us to steer the robot in space. This is a previous colleague, Margaret Code, who I believe is in the audience right now, who is steering the robot here. But we're using the pouch motors to kind of steer it back and forth. So we want to create more complex shapes. So what are we going to do? Well, we're going to start with again, kind of building block. And our building block here is going to be a helix. It's pretty easy to make a helix. All we have to do is just wrap our actuator in a helix around the robot, and we can get a helix out. And the reason why we're going to use a helix as our base shape here is because it gives us a variable curvature and a variable torsion, which we then can use to make a wide variety of shapes. But we're not done by just choosing a helix. We actually have to figure out the kinematics here. So we want to know, based off of this initial shape of our actuator, defined by some variables, what is the shape of the robot we get at? Long story short, again, just cutting to the obligatory math slide, we're actually able to find closed form kinematics for this, which is really nice. Now, we've got 3 equations on each side. Again, you might think of these as sort of your inverse kinematics and these as your forward kinematics. Now, even though we have 3 equations, we don't have 3 degrees of freedom. This one here is kind of our actual actuation. This is changing how long this line is. That's what we're pulling on if we are actually actuating one of those tendons I showed earlier. But these kinematics work well. We're able to predict the shape of helices that we construct, measuring their shapes, and they match well to our model. So now we're going to take this and we're going to generalize it beyond helices by just stacking a bunch of helices together. So we're going to change, one of the parameters over time, and we're going to get a more interesting shape. And if we do that at a fine enough resolution, then this interesting shape can become a wide variety of shapes that we want it to. So in the interest of time, I'll briefly show kind of the results here. So this is one shape that we've got. And again, our model predicts well that shape. Let me go to, so we can use this then to design with a lot of kind of maybe a little less intelligent optimization than Patrick was talking about, but using some of the optimization toolkits, we can find a shape that allows us to match a shape that is desired, like something like tying a robot in a knot. But what I want to talk about briefly before I end this talk here is some recent work that we've just submitted by one of my students, where we are looking at better ways to do this. So that previous work that I showed with tying a robot in a knot, it works, but it's a little cumbersome on the actual optimization side. So here we're talking about now more intelligent ways to match target trajectories. And the main thing that we're doing is we're going to have a shape fit by a Bezier curve. That's going to tell us the shape we're trying to match through some desired points and desired tangents. And then we're going to fit to that Bezier curve with piecewise arcs. Just going through the results here briefly, we are essentially taking that Bezier curve and breaking it down into segments as we need to get the accuracy we need. We can then match in space, these arbitrary curves through points fairly well, again, for soft robotic shapes, with both these preformed shapes and with actuated shapes. We get a little bit of error due to gravity, but overall, we are pretty well able to match our target shape in space. So with that, I think I'm just about out of time. So I will finish with just some kind of concluding remarks here. So again, my philosophy here is we can build building blocks for design and modeling for soft robotics through targeted design, observation of heuristics, and decomposition of complex behaviors. And these creative models are able to predict our behavior well enough to design more complex interactions. Now, the overall accuracy is going to be limited by our assumptions and simplifications made. This is very true in soft robotics. We have to make some simplifying assumptions. Otherwise, we're going to get locked up in kind of calculations all day. And in the future, hopefully, I hope we can apply these methods to get some more rapid prototyping and understanding of new soft robotic functions focused on specific tasks. So with that, I will thank the students, Shashank, who did some of the work on the bellows actuator, and Sichang, who did that work on the shape design of growing robots, as well as the rest of my students. I'll have to get a lab picture so that I can show you guys all off in the rad lab, and then all of my various collaborators for kind of earlier stages of this work and the various funding sources. And with that, I will turn it back over to Karthik.
Hey, thank you so much. Very inspiring talks by both of you. If the audience want to type in questions, please start typing them. I will start organizing them and asking our speakers to answer. But also a side note, I asked Laura and Patrick what they like to do besides work on robots for research, which is itself fun. So Laura likes to pretend like a robot maybe, and also do stitching and crochet and sort of kinds of things in that direction. And Patrick likes to play with his younger children, particularly the young ones like 2 years old, and also likes to bike. So let me start off with my general question. One question I have, both your philosophies of thinking about robots are somewhat different, and there's some commonalities among them. What if you can try to make a more jointed robot, cheetah and exoskeleton that Patrick is working on, with some of the ideas that Laura presented, the more soft ones? Can you make a soft robot become hard and do hard tasks? And one of my class projects this time is actually climbing the coconut trees. Apparently the coconut trees in India are very tall, that variety, and all the people that cut coconuts, very risky to climb. They all have gone to the Arab countries to work. So they're training monkeys to climb up. And some of your solutions, like this vine climbing robot, could go there and become hard somehow and start cutting the coconuts. So maybe both of you can comment two sides of your own research on perhaps how we can fill this in-between ground that we all want to produce robots that can do both your sides and being one robot.
Yeah, I think maybe I'll start on that. It's a great question, and I think at least from my perspective, this is a big thing for soft robotics to as a field to sort of figure out. There are some big steps that need to be taken in terms of building up the control, the modeling, the sensing that is expected at the more traditional, the rigid robotic side of things, to better merge the fields. Now, interestingly, I'm not sure I'm settled on whether the language that traditional robotics talks about robots will be the same language we talk about soft robotics. But I think we're going to have something along those lines in order to understand sort of how these systems work together. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's right now there is a divide, right? The people that work on rigid robots are, they're worried about precision down to, maybe tens of microns if you're working with an industrial manipulator. And you just can't get that with soft robot models or with soft robots. And they each have their, unique benefits. And we've seen, attaching soft robot grippers to the end of rigid manipulators. And those have had a great deal of impact. I think without these two worlds really having to mesh and combine with one another, but they're, our human bodies, right, are made of bones and all these soft, squishy materials. And we'd like to be able to design robots that incorporate, both types of components. I think it just takes some intrepid collaborations to really kind of bridge the different types of thinking that traditionally inhabit these different subdisciplines.
And I think the one thing I will say is, Karthik, to your point of, can we make a soft robot that becomes like incredibly rigid? I think, that is a very much in a materials problem. That's where I think we need to get more people on board in terms of collaboration. This is a thing that I'm incredibly interested in, because I think that is one of the, if you can have a soft robot that shifts to this very rigid system, then we're talking about, something that inherently bridges this gap. But the orders of magnitude we're talking about, the ability to stiffen a soft robot is nowhere near the rigid robots level. We can get one order of magnitude maybe stiffer than the materials we start with. And it's also interesting on the rigid robotics side of things. I started off doing series elastic actuation. So I know, kind of coming from rigid robots going to compliance, where even there you're not going very soft ever, for controls reasons. So we're kind of going in both of these directions, but we're not really meeting in the middle in terms of the stiffness levels we're talking about. Yeah.
Great comments from both of you. Sort of along your directions, I recently did some homework on what's happening in the commercialization side of both your sides, or everything in between. And I was surprised to see that Soft Robotics, one of the companies, actually cited increased demand for soft grippers for their hard robots, and raised an additional 10 million. I think they raised close to 50 million or so. That's kind of surprising to me that they could make a case for such a raise. And also on Patrick's side, I was wondering when I can go to the market and buy a galloping cheetah for the kids, and I teach toy design, so it's kind of cool, So I'm kind of curious from both your perspectives, how you see the future evolving, and both your sites becoming more ubiquitous. Maybe it's from the exoskeleton side, or from soft grippers themselves becoming more like robotic forms, like what you're talking about.
Yeah, I guess, Karthik, to your question of, when can you purchase a galloping quadruped, it depends on the limit on your Amex card, because if you can go up to 70K, you can go on to Boston Dynamics website and get yourself a spot. But I guess in all seriousness, we've seen a lot of market penetration on the quadruped side, and surveillance type applications. Again, these like look but don't touch type applications. Surveillance and monitoring at work sites and at chemical plants, And I think as economies of scale kick in and more people can get their hands on these hardware platforms, then we'll see more applications opening up. But yeah, in terms of soft gripper hands, I think the manipulation landscape is just really difficult in terms of the complexity of the environment. In locomotion, we have to worry about different types of terrains, but for manipulation, I have to worry about different types of mugs and plates and all sorts of crazy different shapes. And so I think in terms of quadruped applications, the maturity of manipulation in the coming 5 to 10 years is going to open up many more applications, and I'll be excited to see where that goes.
Yeah, great. Yeah, so I'm going to post one of the questions asked by here on the chat. So he's asking both of you, do you think you can use your modeling techniques to model the soft robots that make up the human body, muscles, and other soft tissues to predict rigid human robot skeleton system to inform the exoskeleton prosthetic actuation and reactions? Sort of perhaps coincidentally, use case for the first question we asked. Maybe this should be our joint paper next time.
This is a very interesting question. I'm sure Patrick has more exact things to say on it. So I will just say my one comment from my side, which is soft tissue modeling, especially when we're talking about like how you can attach to the body and like localize the body, is incredibly interesting. And looking at there's been some recent work just looking at how do you understand the stiffness of someone's skin and their kind of soft tissues for things like haptics, exoskeletons. So I think that that's a growing field, and I'm anticipating we'll see some results for that, for better melding of robots and humans in the next few years.
Yeah, so I guess we've been looking at estimating the goals and desires of humans from the standpoint of walking speed, and getting models of this kind of one number is challenging. Now, if you start thinking about modeling the entire human body, we're talking about hundreds of degrees of freedom, more hundreds of actuators, and that's just an incredibly difficult modeling task in terms of every muscle itself has different parameters that govern its force length relationship, force velocity relationship, and so I think it's just I personally feel like it's probably too much to ask to try to get right. Like you can model it and get close, but if you in terms of getting the minutia right, it's just that's more complexity than I want to bite off.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
I guess what you're saying is there's going to be some diminishing returns after some level of modeling on that part, but you certainly appreciate that direction of thinking, I guess.
Yeah, and I mean, you don't, I think in terms of some of the work out of Scott Delp's group in terms of optimizing assistance and that type of thing, you don't have to get things perfectly right to make more informed choices about how to control your assistive devices. And I think, yeah, like in any engineering problem, all of our problems are complex, and it's a battle of managing complexity and making the right choices that give us the most bang for the buck.
Right. So any other questions from the audience? There's only a few of us here, so feel free to unmute and ask. If not, I do have a lot more questions. When I was talking to Patrick and Laura, we very soon finished our half an hour and still had a lot more different questions to think about. So anybody in the audience wants to?
I think I do see one question from Margaret in the chat.
Go ahead.
She said, how far are we from being able to apply the model-based control schemes like Pat talked about to the soft robots like I talked about? I think that's an incredibly interesting question, and one that I would place, I would kind of place to Patrick as well, of like, what do we need to be able to do in terms of actuation on soft robots to then start applying this model-based control? Because I know that some soft robots, some compliant robot systems, especially continuum robots, have done some amount of model predictive control, but it's not really widespread. And my first thought would be that we just don't have enough control authority over the resulting shape. in order to make it make sense. But maybe we're also just we're missing models that are good enough to do model predictive control.
Yeah, I totally agree with your second point that, you know, these PDE models for how soft robots move through the world, there have been some very impressive numerical methods that folks have developed over the past, 5 years or so for simulating these systems. But I don't think that the field has got to a point where those are kind of like a, take it to the bank technology in the way that we have for dynamic models of our rigid robots, in terms of, there being a textbook method. And so I think that's just an aspect of maturity of the field that hopefully will change over the next five to 10 years. And I think then we'll be ready.
Yeah. And to that point, I think, you maybe got a sense from the talk that I gave, but the different ways we model systems, soft systems, are very kind of scattershot now. Some people are very on the team of, finite element simulation and things like that. And I think that's where, Patrick, a lot of the results you're talking about have come out of. But there are a lot of downsides with that as well, in terms of complexity and computation time, which, don't necessarily make them one size fits all solutions.
Great. If there are more questions, that's good. But meanwhile, I have another question or thoughts for you to comment on. Both of you had some use of this personalization, right? Like Laura was sort of almost saying, like, one robot for every different task. And for side, I would say, I might want to make all kinds of legged robots of different kinds and try them out. So from that point of view, clearly there's need for toolkits, tools, education, for the lack of better words, textbook based ideas, right? So I would like both your comments on what do you foresee as the nature of research, and especially open source kind of research that people can reuse in order to experiment and create new types of robots, perhaps in senior design classes and so on, just elevating the level of projects that come out of universities.
Yeah, I think one part of that, maybe that's just a comment before answering the question on, like, how do we transfer these into the education setting, is I do wonder, I think there's some philosophy behind the idea of one robot for every task, but I think it may also be a limitation of the capabilities of soft robot systems right now. Because if I could build a soft robot that made that actuation that tied itself in a knot, and also made, that shape that kind of curled itself up, and also made this other shape, that's probably what I would be working on right now. And maybe I'll get to that point sometime soon. We're looking at directions to go there. But at this point, there's this disconnect between how many degrees of freedom you can control well and how complex your shape can get. So that's sort of one comment on that, and I'm interested to see where that goes soon. But what that does mean is that, in my mind at least, this sort of like targeted design is a very interesting teaching tool for, maybe not for senior design projects, but just for teaching about robotics concepts in general. So you can give someone and teach them how to build a soft muscle or a specific type of actuator, and they can model how it moves, and they can sort of rediscover kinematics, dynamics, force relationships, all for themselves, for a robot that no one's built before, right? Versus, I think, when we're teaching robotics more traditionally, we kind of say, here is the one way it's done. And that's maybe a little less design focused way of thinking about robotics, at least. Yeah.
I love everything that Laura said. I won't add anything else.
That's pretty cool. Pretty cool. So yeah, so we have seen different types of thinking that both of you have expressed in your research. So how do you think that thinking will change as we go forward with your own research, or are you sort of happy with your philosophy. I mean, I've seen some implicit philosophy expressed in both your talks. Where do you think your research is going to go in terms of the challenges that both your areas are going to be meeting?
Yeah, so I guess in terms of, as the field shifts and changes, I think we need to be adaptable to that. And, we've seen with the state-of-the-art and quadruped locomotion, locomotion on level surfaces is getting close to being a technology, in the sense that, being able to handle very discontinuous type terrain. If I'm only allowed to step here and there, as opposed to having a nice paved way, like that's the area where legged robots bring the most value over wheeled vehicles. We haven't seen as much research on that in that direction, and so that's kind of a new area that we're starting to look at, that brings in some new aspects of perception and control in different ways. On the assistive device side, we've seen some really phenomenal open source hardware that we've been, this has really kind of changed the direction of what we've been doing in the group, shifting a little bit more to prosthetic legs, as opposed to focusing as much on exoskeletons. And then I think, we'll continue moving in that direction, just due to the access, and then also the impact that we can have due to the communities that are rallied around these open source platforms.
Very cool. To answer from I guess the soft robotics side, I think this is in the points that we've been talking about, the disconnect maybe between traditional robotics and soft robotics. That's where I think I see the most interesting problems in the future of the field. And that's also where I see, there might be a lot of hard questions in terms of what is a good soft robot coming in the future. We've made lots of cool soft robots, but now I want to make good soft robots. And I think to earlier questions, the example of the grippers is perhaps like the most quintessential example we have right now, where soft grippers are positioned where they are solving this really difficult manipulation problem in a different way, and using the exactness, the preciseness of traditional robot arms to kind of overcome their limitations, maybe. But they might be overtaken by better manipulation technologies on the rigid robot side at some point in time. So yeah, to put it in a sort of Kurt Blythe way, I want to see good soft robots and soft robots that are kind of out there doing interesting things. Yeah.
Very cool. So thank you so much for both your talks. Very inspiring and very cool work. You're the rising stars, the future. So I want to give the podium back to Sid and Partha to close up on this, on this session.
There are like significant number of questions from the audience. I can see them in the chat box. So I can maybe pose a few questions to the speakers here. So one question I see from Margaret. I don't see if Margaret is around.
Yeah, I think both were asked already.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
So any more questions? I don't see any other question.
Patrick, did you have a probing question?
Yeah, I did. So
I have an interesting. I have a kind of a take that comes from somebody working on more at the interface of like chemistry and biology and things like that. So one example that Laura you showed, where you showed that one soft robotic arm, if I may call, or an appendix around, right? Now imagine if I am using that to model an actual biological problem in vivo.
Yeah.
There is a lot of chemical signals going on.
Yes. Yeah.
The entire thing that you captured is basically a mechanophysical issue. How do you account for the chemical issues? The chemical interactions between the, let's say that appendage is there, maybe something like how do you talk about it?
So this is an incredibly interesting question when we talk about soft robots as like analogs for biological systems, which I think is a very, very interesting application of both robots, but soft robots specifically. And this is where I think some of that language of like imitation breaks down a little bit, because we're, maybe taking more inspiration than imitation in some ways when we do that. Now, I do think there's ways to kind of get at that, but it's sort of a question of what scale do you want your imitation, your inspiration to be at? If we want to imitate these chemical signals, not work that I've been working on, but some researchers at, I believe, IIT in Italy, Barbara Mazzoli has been doing some plant-inspired robots that actually do things like tropisms, like they follow the sun, or other things like that. So they're not getting at these chemical reactions, but they are getting at the behaviors that come from the chemical reactions, which is an interesting thing in of itself. Yeah.
Like one example. I mean, I think Karthik has posed a very interesting question where you are requested to ask one question to each other. But before, just one comment. So I had some prior experience of working on biofilms, like bacterial biofilms. So bacterial biofilms, people have been doing quite a bit of work. They can be thought of kind of a soft robots.
Yeah.
The way they grow, those kind of biofilm streamers they form. I developed some equation on bacterial biofilm streamers. What hasn't been there, for example, this biofilm, I mean, your picture, Laura, reminded of me of the bacterial biofilm streamers. That what happens if you have these bacterial biofilm streamers growing in a bacterial colony, in an active bacterial colony, where there are living bacteria moving around. And then you have this kind of appendage-like structure going on.
Interesting.
But there, the bacteria themselves keep on secreting this kind of, they call extracellular polysaccharide, EPS. And in the process, they exchange these chemical interactions between them. A very difficult problem.
Yeah.
Yeah, but maybe something you can think about.
I think this comes down to a lot of multi-robot systems as well. It's very interesting. I'll have to think about that more. Yeah.
I will stop here. So I think there is one very interesting question that Karthik has posed. Yeah. So like Patrick and Laura, you can each ask a question to the other.
Yeah. I guess with whatever time we have left. Laura, I mentioned this co-design work that we've been doing. And essentially what we've been trying to do was to come up with a way to design to maximize morphological computation. Like that's kind of the goal. But then if you're going to formulate some design automation or design optimization problem, you now have to come up with some metric for morphological computation. Yeah. I feel like morphological computation is this thing that like we know it when we see it, but like I don't. It's very nebulous and ethereal in terms of actually saying what it is, and in particular, then how to quantify it. And so I'm curious. I'm asking you this question under the condition that I have no idea how to answer it.
Yes.
But do you think, are there good metrics of it, or do you think it's foolish to try to metricize it?
Oh, that is a wonderful question. I don't think there's good metrics for it yet. It's definitely, you're right, and it's that you'll know it when you see it sort of thing right now. Like I use that word for that second thing I talked about, if that's like morphological computation, but very much in that, like, you know it when you see it. What I think is sort of needed is, yes, this idea of how do we know what counts as like an unknown environment? Because that's like the big thing for morphological computation is what inputs are you going to put in for how your environment can vary, and then what behaviors do you want it to do as a result? And so I would be optimistic, and I don't think we should give up on the ideas of morphological computation as as probably an achievable design goal just yet. But that's certainly, what you're sort of talking about of like defining your outputs is sort of the best we've got right now. And I'm interested, I think it's an interesting question to think about, like, how do we get past that? Which does actually go in. I had a question written down that I thought of when you were talking, which is maybe in the same sort of lines, but what counts as a disturbance when we're interacting with an unknown environment? like how do we define like a disturbance versus like just what we're expecting to see?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the somewhat of a cop-out answer would be anything that's not in our model. But
Yeah.
there are so many things that are not in our model, and you know, my friction at my joints is going to be a disturbance because it changes with temperature, and I haven't modeled that, and I don't think we should model that. And there's like self disturbances and external disturbances from the environment, and you know, even we're modeling the environment as rigid, but our environment is not perfectly rigid, and that's a disturbance. And so I'm very liberal with what I consider to be disturbances. It's but again, it's very hard to kind of capture the full envelope of those when you're thinking about designing these controllers off board, which I think, you know, kind of ties into your response of what's hard for quantifying morphological computation. So
yeah. Well, yeah, it's a good question to think about regardless from both sides of this sort of discussion.
Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you so much, all of your time. And Partha, are we good to close now?
I think so. First of all, thank you all very much. Wonderful talks as always. And also Karthik, thanks for touring this beautiful conversations. The conversations after that, typically it just you know, takes over. So I'm so glad to see that happening again and again. And now both of you know to talk more about among yourselves between the two of you and with Karthik. So I think with that I would close here. Thank you all very much and have a great weekend. Thank you.
Yeah. Bye-bye.
Bye.
thank you.
Thank you.